pleasure to welcome Sir Norman Foster to the AA. Really grateful that he's agreed to speak here tonight. In his book, L'architettura della città, Aldo Rossi speaks about the theater at Nîmes, which is also the site of one of Sir Norman's projects. He says, the amphitheater at Nîmes had a precise and unequivocal form as well as function. It was not thought of as an indifferent container, but rather was highly precise in its structure, its architecture, and its form. But a succession of external events at a dramatic moment in history reversed its function, and the theater became a city. This theater city functioned like a fortress and was adapted to enclose and defend its inhabitants. I think Sir Norman's Carré d'Art project in Nîmes of 1993 seems to achieve much of what the amphitheater did previously. Maybe it doesn't defend in the sense of the way in which the word defend was used for the amphitheater of its inhabitants, but certainly it provides a shelter, it guards them, and provides a house of the people, in a sense, in the city of Nîmes. I think the Carré d'Art is an excellent example of Sir Norman Foster's understanding and commitment to the relationship between architecture and the city. And where I think we find that this new building, in conjunction with the Maison Carrée, makes a new urban space, not only at the level of the place itself, but also establishes a new sectional relationship, which we discover as we experience the building sectional relationship to the city itself at various levels. Sir Norman Foster studied architecture and city planning at Manchester University, and after graduating in 1961 was awarded a Henry Fellowship at Yale University, where he received his master's degree in architecture. In 1967, Norman and Wendy Foster established Foster Associates, working with Buckminster Fuller on a number of projects between 1968 and 1983. Foster Associates developed into Sir Norman Foster and Partners, an international practice whose work has since its inception received over 120 awards and citations for excellence and won 21 international competitions. In 1983, Norman Foster received the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture, and in 1990 he received a knighthood in the Queen's Birthday Honours. Since 1991, he has received the Mies van der Rohe Award for European Architecture, the Gold Medal for the French Academy of Architecture, as well as many others. In 1994, he received the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal for Architecture, and in 1995, the practice was awarded the Queen's Award for Export. Among the firm's most recent projects include a number of headquarters for Commerzbank in Frankfurt, which we recently exhibited as in relation to our OVA Arab exhibit here, a new airport at Cheklap Kok for Hong Kong, covering the area of 1,248 acres, which is the largest project in the world, a congress center for the city of Valencia, a new German parliament Reichstag in Berlin, and the Al Faisla complex in Riyadh, and a 58-meter long aluminium-hulled ocean-going yacht. Would you please join me in welcoming Sir Norman Foster?
Thank you. I hope you don't mind if in the spirit of the evening, which I hope will be informal rather than formal, I take off my coat. Mozan asked me to talk about projects which might relate to the city, might have a context in terms of landscaping, planning, but particularly to try to give some insights into the process that lies behind the finished building. So I thought it might be interesting perhaps to go back over one project from the past, Stansted, and talk about, rather show some of the things that perhaps normally I wouldn't show if I was just talking about the building, but seeing as one of the themes is lighting, amongst other themes which I'll touch on shortly, then I I thought that was perhaps appropriate also to, on some of the projects that Mohsen's mentioned, to show the work in progress. So I'll start with the slides. The first two slides really are reminders, reminding me to press the two buttons here. So we can have the lights, please. It's a reminder about change and accelerating rate of change over time, and the way that that might affect the city, the changing patterns in the way that we live or work or travel, communicate, and change in terms of an individual building, the point at which that building ceases to be able to accommodate change and has to be replaced, and the role of history and tradition in that process, and what the new symbols or gateways of the city as it stretches out beyond its historic center. And in the course of that, the issue of how you revitalize, how you regenerate, how you give new life to a historic building as these waves of change overtake it. And the image on the right, a reminder about the importance of light, the humanizing poetic dimension, that aspect that you cannot quantify, the quality of light, the way that it will inform interior spaces, and also a reminder of the ecological implications that also lie behind that. So if we talk about change, then the project that I mentioned related to airports, in terms of what is the life of a building, and I think that, you know, off the top of the head, probably somebody would say, well, maybe it's 50 years. It's interesting that less than 50 years ago, that was Heathrow Airport on the left-hand slide, which is currently the largest airport in the world in terms of international passenger movements. And on the right, very much an inspiration for Stansted, the historic airport, Atlanta Airport in the 30s, when you had a very clear sense of orientation in that you walked towards the aircraft when you departed, and when the aircraft came back, you walked towards the land side. So it was a very clear orientation. It was, I suppose, the ultimate analog building. You had a clear sense of direction and orientation. And in that sense, like many small airports, an important model for the rural site, which was destined to be London's third airport at Stansted on the left. And very much going back to that early model of the historic airport and what today still retains the clarity with the smaller scale, many small general aviation airfields, as opposed to the typical international airport, which is a kind of digital maze, almost like a new town, and somehow you hang the air travel on the shopping mall. And really the project being a quest to see to what extent it was possible to rediscover that clear orientation that would put the true user first amongst the multitude of competing priorities, all essential in terms of throughput, baggage, security, but really saying it has to be a good experience for the person who matters most, who's the passenger. And to that extent, exploring the potential to be able to, don't know quite how to make this, to be able to move through at one level, and the baggage which would descend because it wouldn't know the difference and would end up at the point where it most wants to be, which is on the apron. This was the first model that was shown to the British Airports Authority Board. And Stansted had been the subject, or rather the third London airport had been the subject of inquiries, which today would fashionably be called environmental impact inquiries. But the way in which a very large terminal could integrate into the landscape was a key factor, and taking advantage of the slope of the ground, was the ability to dig in this two-story building, so its expression externally was really below the tree line. So it reads from the outside as a single-story building. The trees of the structure are an interesting parallel in that the structure of the building, which is a series of prefabricated modules, each individual tree, also provides the movement of energy, of light, of air in terms of distribution and return. And that quest for the clarity of a land side and an air side by the gardening device, the 18th century device of the ha-ha, where the car park is depressed, then returning you have the illusion of the largely untouched countryside beyond, as opposed to the aircraft that in the opposite direction you would walk towards. Elaborating that idea of the tree further, this airport and many that have since followed it takes another view of mechanical and electrical servicing. A traditional airport up to this point, with very, very few exceptions, was essentially a solid roof, which was the support for the air handling units on the roof, and then the underside essentially being festooned by ductwork, fluorescent lights. So the breakthrough here, which was really generated by, if you like, those humanistic determinants that I've mentioned of the quality of the space, making it a friendly occasion, this sense of travel, was also rooted in a quest for a lower energy building, one that would cost less to run, would consume less energy. And also what was described to us as a new generation airport, which could mean many things. It meant some of the things that I've tried to describe so far this evening. But to BAA, it meant a dramatic reduction in the first cost of the building, 20% less than anything that had been spent at Heathrow or Gatwick. And undoubtedly, there's an integration, a synergy between the concept of the structure, which just supports a roof, which is about keeping off the elements, insulating, letting in the light, keeping out the rain. But essentially, all the heavy plant that would normally sit on top of that roof is relegated to the place where it most comfortably sits, and as a shorter life item can easily be replaced, which is in the undercroft. The undercroft which provides the ultimate flexibility for change, rather like a large-scale version of a suspended floor in an office, which at a very late stage in the design process, when not in the design process, an early stage in the construction process, when the building was under construction, the two chairmen of British Airports Authority and British Rail got together for lunch and decided it would be a great idea to actually bring the railway station into the building itself. And at that very late stage, with the building on site and underway, the flexibility for change offered by this large undercroft enabled the railway station to be incorporated quite effortlessly. You can also see the ingredients below. You can see the road, which enables you to change the heavy plant, which eventually drives that building. And that's out of sight, out of mind. The experience of the building is the main space and that sense of orientation. Coming back to the point that Mohsen and I talked about when we were discussing what might be appropriate for this evening, the amount of design and research and energy and experimentation to get the lighting so that it has the sparkle of a shaft of sunlight on the floor, because these reflectors here, which are perforated metal in such a way that you don't get the black hole effect at night when you look up into it, but they're reflecting a proportion of the light back onto the underside of this vault here. These are 18-meter spans center to center of the trees. And it's quite interesting when you take away those kite-like additions, those sculptural elements, the roof actually goes darker. It has a very, very interesting effect, and here you can see that close up. That has a rather interesting history as a development. Unfortunately, we don't have the full story, but here are some extracts from that. Out in the West Country at that time, models like this were being moved around and were being studied and photographed, working with Claude Engel, the lighting consultant. And then the scale of that would move up to look at the different effects of grouping spotlights at the bottom of the tree as opposed to floodlights in this version here. Mindful all the time that, that in the final building you'd be able to access within the tree to be able to change bulbs, because an airport is a 365-day-a-year operation. So being able to change things without putting up ladders and hoists and so on is really quite important. One of the technical challenges was that as we developed this further in our in the mock-up area, the research area, which is this rather grotty shed in North London, we realized that it was impossible to get really within the base of the tree sufficient off-the-peg floodlights, and that led us to the development of a light fitting, which is very much part of I think the process of our working, in that if quite frequently a catalogue item is not necessarily the best thing that you can buy for the money that is available. And it doesn't really mean that it comes off a shelf. The fact that it's in a catalogue means that somebody's got a set of drawings, and they've got a factory and the production process and the people, so they'll actually make it for you, which is why they have delivery dates. And if you understand the production processes sufficiently and you know the design parameters, then part of the process, it's very rewarding to be able to develop within the scope of a project individual elements. Those might be carpets, lifts, escalators, as the case of Willis Faber, and here a light fitting which was developed by ERCO and has since become a standard light fitting which is now on the market. So because of the prefabrication and the fact that the structure on the roof came very, very early in the process, it was possible to use the building as the final working prototype and mock-up. And that night lighting, as we can see here, is a very important part of the image of this building, which is the gateway. It is one of the gateways to London, the equivalent of earlier ports in that sense. I could talk at great length about not only the poetry of the natural light, but also if you'll pardon the expression, the poetry of the hydraulics, the ability to be able for a roof to drain that roof, which is the size of 2 football pitches, from the sides, because if you brought any traditional form of rainwater pipe down in the heart of that building, it would dwarf the structure. So the whole scale relationship of the way that space is ordered by the structure internally would be destroyed, quite apart from that maintenance aspect that I've talked about. So a tremendous amount of research and development went into the siphonic system, which creates a solid tube of water through these stainless steel pipes, which diminish in their bore as they descend towards the ground, as opposed to the traditional rainwater pipes, which are essentially a column of air around the outside edge of which water moves. There are a number of analogies with aircraft in the building. One of the problems is uplift on this highly efficient roof. So the airflow at the edges is broken down and created as a turbulence layer by these equivalent of the flaps on an aircraft wing on the edge. The end result in terms of the lighting and the way that works is now quite well known. It was, interestingly, a model for the subsequent airport, which is the Hong Kong airport. And to try and explain why Hong Kong is as large as it is and why it is top of the list in terms of its international passenger movements at 35 million international movements a year, is because of its rather unusual location, which in a flight of less than 4 hours brings it within reach of 49% of the world's population. So it really is quite a concentration, and evolves out of the inadequacies of the existing jet black cock. And when that goes in less than 2 years' time, then one of the great aviation experiences ever will sadly go with it. If anybody who's ever flown into Hong Kong Airport will agree. Very stimulating experience. I took this slide out, which has on it 1992, and in 1992, this little bit of land here and this water was the site of the new Hong Kong airport. Things move quickly in Hong Kong, as you can see where the rock outcrops were here, this is the man-made island. Putting that man-made island on a map of London, you can get an idea of the scale. Here's the river, Buckingham Palace and the park, and well, it's about 6 kilometers long from there to there, and it's just over 3,000 acres. And when when the newspapers were full of all the reports about will it happen, won't it happen, China, Peking, Hong Kong, London, it was actually happening, with the largest dredging fleet in the world making the man-made island. That was the competition model on the left, and not a current photograph, but you can start to see the plan dimension of this footprint here. The footplate, we're looking from here on the model. The footplate is about the same size as the Canary Wharf development. The scale is very difficult to grasp. I apologize for the slide being upside down there, but it doesn't really make much difference. All it's saying is that you can easily drop Wembley Arena into the baggage hall with space to spare. The mechanical plant occupies about the same area and volume of the Lloyd's building. It's quite the statistics really are quite remarkable for the building. This is the early models from the competition entry, and the transportation, which was originally totally integrated into the building, so that you would actually arrive by the train from central Hong Kong. Sadly, that, for all kinds of reasons outside our control, has been a separate building which is attached. So, but apart from that, the original design has been very faithfully replicated. Because of the scale and speed of the building that was required, I mean, it creates in approximately 5 years more than has happened over a 50-year period at Heathrow. And the area of this terminal is the combined area of JFK and Heathrow together. So the concept of one structural module, which is 4 times the plan area of the Stansted module at 36 meters square, which is about the same plan size as our Cranfield Library, would enable a high degree of prefabrication and control of quality to be able to realize this original vision through the extraordinary complexities of international tendering and management, taking into account the fact that everything has to be brought by water, including the 10 tons of rice a day to feed the workforce of of 24,000, and the kind of hotels which are also part, and the creation of a moneyless society so that we don't have the crime problems of gambling and all that. So it's interesting to compare the competition structure with the first bay which has emerged on the spine here. Controlling the thing on site is quite interesting. We have a group of 35 people who leave Hong Kong Central at 8 o'clock in the morning and 1 hour later arrive on the island, and then they're back on the mainland at 8 o'clock that night. And for example, to check out and to quality control the external wall is something like a 5-kilometer run around the perimeter. So you can get an idea of the scale of the building as it's emerging. Picking up one of the themes that I talked about, which is far removed from Hong Kong and airports, but continues common themes in terms of lighting and energy, and picks up the theme of the regenerating the historic building and the way that history of the past can shape the future of a building, and the way in which it can maybe maintain the imprint of that past. The Reichstag and its very checkered history. Here I think this is the May 1945 eventual capture by the Russians at a cost of some 4,000 lives, and the way in which that building has changed over time. It's always been a kind of focal point, a rallying point, literally on the edge of the east-west divide. This is the west side. The Berlin Wall was almost physically attached to the back of the building. And one of the things that struck us at the time that we looked at the building, when we made the decision to enter the competition, was that along with all the tourists who would walk up the steps here and eventually find that there was no way in, a feeling that really that historic identity, the way in which the original main floor, prime level, could be reinstated, because you would creep in from the side into this building, into this very uncomfortable space below that original public level, which was completely different from the Reichstag of the past. And so from the outside you would have the illusion of a 19th century building and kind of expect the sort of interior that you might find on the left, only to find that it's been replaced by a kind of late 50s, early 60s interior, as we see the same space on the right. And the original competition, of which this is a very, very brief extract from our submission, we were one of 3 who were placed equal first, was for a huge amount of space. I mean, roughly about 3 times the amount of space that the Reichstag could accommodate. And at that particular point, using the devices of a podium base that would ramp into the landscape, that would accommodate cars, and a ring of offices and administrative space around it extending out to the river, and then hollowing out the center of this, creating the new chamber, glazing that in so that light would come in, a roof that would be very much about harvesting energy and providing what the politicians described in informal meetings as the need in this area for a ceremonial outside space to mark the fact that for anything from a celebration to mark the removal of the wall or a Michael Jackson concert, this would be the rallying point. And then, very importantly, to create a new public space which was at the upper level, that would give the citizens of Berlin and visitors alike a new perspective of the city, and would symbolically put the public on top of the politicians to whom they're answerable. So this is an image from that original submission, where very much you could look into the heart of the assembly. The democratic process was revealed and made transparent. And so the role of the public in that was really quite important. Well, at the time that the three prize-winning schemes were revealed in Berlin, and there was a lot of public debate, there was also another competition that was announced at the same time, or rather the results of that competition, which was the Sprayborg planning competition. And Axel Schultes won that competition and developed a kind of linear strip which ran east-west and was located quite close to the Reichstag. A number of other changes had taken place. There was a very different economic climate in Germany. The original euphoria of unification was wearing off, and the financial realities were being faced up to. So the brief for the second stage competition was dramatically different. And these two images here are photographs of part of the presentation that I made to the second stage jury with my colleagues from Berlin. And what it was saying was that the original competition brief was for 33,000 square meters. The Reichstag itself can take 14,000, and the new brief was for 9,000. And it was quite interesting. The competitors were asked to modify their schemes. That's a bit like saying, you know, a competition for a bus, and we love your bus, but it's changed slightly. We only want a car. It's a very important car, so would you modify the bus? The result was that, of course, you had to start again. And I demonstrated with the presentation that we'd prepared that our starting point was Parliament, the way that Parliament worked. And we undertook to try to know more about the workings of Parliament than the politicians, which was not difficult because the politicians were, not surprisingly, primarily concerned with their world and were really very unaware of the backup that was required. And out of that, we challenged their brief. We said it's madness to ask for 9,000 square meters in a building that will take 14,000. Actually, we've demonstrated since that it can take 16,000. And through the workings of Parliament, we're able to demonstrate that basically the session rooms, the faction rooms, should be in the same building. They should not be removed. That there was a strong economic case for putting them in the same building, getting better utilization of the original building, but more importantly, bringing the thing to life. The relationship was a very, very close one between the faction meetings and the democratic processes of being called to vote. And then we talked about the history of the building, and we talked about economics. They had refused to give a budget for the thing at the briefing, and we were the only architects who asked for a budget. So our starting point was the minimum cost that you could actually convert the Reichstag into a new Bundestag, a new seat for government. And so we asked them how much they thought it would cost if they went into the building and occupied it, and when they went in, it looked exactly as it did at that time. Well, of course, everybody thought it was a joke, but it wasn't, because the reality was that if you did nothing and you just wanted it as it was, you would have to gut it, take it apart, take out all the toxic asbestos, put it all back together, design another late 50s, early 60s building. So it was going to run into some millions just to do nothing. We also suggested to them that seeing as they, in their house, passed legislation which made stringent demands on homeowners and businesses, quite rightly and in a very progressive sense, to take a strong view on the ecology, the energy that buildings consume, that they surely should set an inspired example to the nation by being seen to take the lead and to take ecology very seriously. Now, the Deutschmark sign here was a thing that was put in afterwards, because at that point we said, do you all know how much it costs to run your building? How much it costs to run your house? How many Deutschmarks a year does it cost? They were horrified to find that it cost 2.5 million Deutschmarks a year just to keep it hot and cold, depending on the seasons. And part of the presentation was to demonstrate the way that they could make very dramatic reductions in that. So we suggested if they couldn't do it on grounds of morality, then they should do it for Deutschmarks. I'm skipping a lot because I want on this to pick up Mozan's point about using it as a vehicle, as a building work in progress, perhaps to show some of the processes that we're going through on the project. There was a ceremonial wrapping and unwrapping, an extraordinary event that the Christo and Jean-Claude created, which I must say I've never been to a city or visited an area of a building and found so much genuine happiness. The feeling, the mood of that city around this building in this area was absolutely extraordinary. It was a highly symbolic and very charged occasion. It marked the start of construction, and the construction of a concept which really was not going to be any kind of pastiche in terms of the past, but really learnt from the past, and in the spirit of the past brought back the prime level, took out a lot of the individual levels that had accumulated in the late 50s and 60s, and with handsome volumes, the same scale of the original spaces, to be able to ascend, to reinstate the western entrance, and then separate movement systems for viewing, seating, and to be able to get people up onto the roof, and eventually to the highest point, the platform, to be able to look beyond the city over the turrets. And here you can see the device, the feature that will control the light, will cut out the solar glare depending on the movement of a shading device on the perimeter of this space, essentially a combination of glass and void which will allow the passage of air, and a spiral ramp that ascends, and then at the top another device which uses aerodynamic shapes to speed up the movement of the prevailing winds and is part of the ventilation system for the building. A very strong emphasis on natural ventilation, the reinstatement of the original courtyards. So this is signaling the democratic process in motion, in the sense that at night it will act like a beacon shining out, so you'll be able to see that, that there is action here. It's tempting to talk about all the analogies of hot air moving out from the debating chamber and being part of the ventilation system, and also, as I was saying, the spiral ramp that enables the public to ascend to the ultimate level here. So it is integrating several functions within that totality. It's also giving the ability to look directly down and to be a part of this space. And the faction rooms that I talked about, they're located here, and they connect with the spaces at the base of these turrets here. The slide on the right is a reminder about one, how can I say, very, very strong philosophy behind the way in which the Reichstag is transformed for today's needs. It would be all too easy to erase the traces of the various wars that have ravaged the building and the graffiti that has accumulated and the different pieces from some of the civic vandalism to the original fabric of the building is a very rich mix of imagery. And so we've unsuccessfully persuaded the politicians and everybody involved in that process that should be retained, because it's a far more powerful message than any exhibition of photographic images of that past would be. So you're in no doubt between what is of the past and what is new, so that for present and future generations it's very much a living museum. Just to trace some of the development of that of the element which is starting to combine the lighting, the movement and the ventilation of the building. This is a mock-up that was made. It's Claude Engel, and it's here in a very primitive form in Maine at the time. More recently, literally 2 weeks ago, when I was there and these photographs were taken, this is a part of a 1:20 model to study the lighting and the acoustics and the space in more depth. And here you can see it's being taken out of the office in Berlin. It's being the Brandenburg Gate, you can see in the back there, and these are being hoisted up to the top of the Reichstag. And then in 10 degrees below, with a strong wind and a wind chill factor bringing it down to 20 degrees below, it's being assembled in place on one of those turrets that I talked about. And here you can start to see the way that it's looking very interestingly, these two photographs, which was just a chance mixture on the light table this afternoon, and I suddenly realized that, quite interestingly, this photograph, I should add that the only way to get this is being lifted up in a metal bucket about this big by the tower crane, hoisted up, and then the tower crane goes around and drops you as if you're in a balloon or a helicopter onto the top of the tower there. And this photograph taken looking west, and when I took this photograph here, I only realized today, of course, very interestingly, there is one of the few remaining parts of the Berlin Wall. Here we're looking eastwards. It's quite interesting to get inside the main assembly space, and with various manipulating the shading devices and the reflectors. Here you can see David Nelson, my partner, who's running the project with Mark Braun, the resident director in Berlin, Claude Engel, the American lighting consultant, and myself looking and playing and tuning and seeing the effect of that on the skyline on this larger scale model. And being able to explore the way in which perhaps the space could be brought to life by letting deliberately shafts of sunlight, rather in the way that, but with a different device, in the way that we'd done at Stansted. So what it's not showing, of course, is it's showing the qualitative process, but in the background there's Claude taking all kinds of readings with meters and feeding them into computers and so on. What is also not, what this mock-up does not reveal, and it's not the purpose of it at this stage too, is that, again, this new structure and is inserted within that shell. So again, there is always the dialogue between the new and the old, and the masonry walls of these courts are being reinstated according to the original facades, because some of those were devastated by the later changes, and all the stuff is taken out of those courtyards, so they become again part of the recreation and also part of the natural ventilation for the building. The scale of the demolition is, and the scale of the space is absolutely awesome. And I've never really been involved with this scale of demolition before. But to see this, this kind of monster machine, which is one of 4 in the world, and I'm told the only one in Europe, with this extraordinary cantilever, which can grab pieces of reinforcing bars and then literally pull them away, is rather like H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds, and it's a real war zone. Anyway, to move from there, which to again a historic building, and the same challenge of how you did I press the wrong button? The British Museum, and again very significant differences, but rather like our work at the Royal Academy, how you might peel away the layers of history to reveal some of the earlier fabric of the building, and in this case a concern with this central space here, which, although you would never know it if you visit the British Museum today, was originally a courtyard. One of the problems of the British Museum is that because of the library, which is to be moved, that you have no clear circulation. You move into the entrance, and then you have to go around the galleries from one gallery to another, which was fine at the time of the original courtyard, when the numbers and the density of occupation was so much less. And even that was not upset by the inclusion of the British Library, which we can see a few years later, the original Smirk building, which I think was 1852. But the sheer popularity of the British Museum, I don't think it's generally appreciated, the fact that it is the most visited single museum in the world, and at 6.5 million visitors a year, compared with the figures here, 4.9 for the Louvre and 4.7 for the Metropolitan. And the real dilemma is that because to get from one gallery you have to go through the adjoining gallery, at any point in time probably only half the people in any one gallery really want to look at the works in that particular gallery. The rest are just people trying to push through to get to the next space. So aside from providing a much needed green space, not a green space but an open space, a focus to be able to provide orientation and resting and cafeteria, all those things that are central to a large museum handling the kind of numbers that we're talking about here. Most importantly, it would be part of a prime route out of which you could then move to the adjoining galleries. And so the creation of this level here, much needed lecture facilities, backup facilities around the dome, and so very much part of the smaller scale a processional route from the forecourt through to this new Great Court, the North Library and Montague Place here. The ability for the first time to be able to properly take cars out of the forecourt, to be able to handle buses at this point here, and to disperse the congestion of the traffic that such an event leads to, and also making the point that it is a very important part of this north-south route in terms of the stations, the university, the British Library, and the Great Court as part of that sequence. A few images to show the way that is developing, and finally, in the most recent version, geometry of the roof, which has now become very, very delicate and a minimum sort of barrier between the outside and the inside. From the brief glimpse of the British Museum, to look at some of the issues raised by a small lycée in the town of Fréjus in the south of France. And Fréjus, like so many small towns and villages, has very simple ingredients. In the old town, certainly a sense of orientation in terms of the fact that there is a small square, it's a gathering point, there's the outdoor cafes. In summer, this is obviously taken in winter here, fairly strong landscaping, urban landscaping tradition, and moving out from that square, very, very straightforward streets which feed into the main space. The lycée, on the very tight, quite stringent government cost limits and a very tight time scale of 1 year, meant really doing something that was essentially very simple, and in terms of the scale of the building, attempted to learn from that very simple diagram of the landscaping, coming to a gathering point, the equivalent of the square in the building, and then out from that square, the street, the boulevard, that would give a very clear sense of orientation. If that was a kind of social theme in the building, then that went hand in hand with the diagram for the way in which a building in a Mediterranean climate could, with using traditional devices which are quite common in indigenous architecture of the Mediterranean, with the double roofs and the flow of air through those roofs, so that the outer roof keeps out the rain, and the inner roof or mass of the building very much to reduce the thermal flywheel effect. So here we can see the double roofs in the school at Fréjus, a thin outer metal roof that keeps off the rain, and then the heavier concrete vault which is protected by that, and the encouragement of air through the building, the street literally being an inside-outside space, so that the detailing of that space and the ability to be able to open windows and create the solar chimney along the length of that route. So the structural diagram, the energy diagram, the ecological diagram, and the social diagram really being imprinted one above the other, and also the siting diagram, which would be on the edge of the platform looking out to the coast and preserving the best trees. So here we can see that equivalent of the boulevard in the heart of the building, the upper level walkways that give access to the classrooms at the upper level, the protected side on one side, and then the private side on the other. Here, the sunny private side, where you would move out from that central square with its cafe, and which would be the social gathering point for the pupils. And again, the way in which that square works, what you don't see is, as you move to the edge, you can just get a glimpse of it, the chairs for the cafe, and the connection here with the route. And then this is on the north side, the public entrance side, and on the south side there, with its shading looking out to the views, that is the social area where everybody would gather outside. These photographs were taken a few weeks ago, and here you can see the contrast, the bustle and the activity of the entrance side, and the calm and quiet and shading of the southern private side. And you can see very clearly the line of the two roofs, the outer roof keeping off the rain and providing that gap which would pull air through. Moving from Fréjus and developing some of those ideas further in this, which is the headquarter project for Commerzbank, and is set to, I think it's probably the tallest high-rise building in Europe on its completion, and it's certainly the first high-rise tower to explore the benefits in terms of those people working there of natural ventilation, and also the potential for saving energy, and quite an interesting relationship between the ability for an individual to control his own environment at the point at which the overall system will take over because the winds are too strong or the outside air temperature is too low. The building is very much a kind of spiral of four-story high. They originally were three-story, four-story high gardens. There are 9 of these gardens which spiral around the building, so that at any point within it, the scale is broken down, it becomes a gathering point. There are 3 different kinds of garden. There's the North American, there's the Mediterranean garden, there's a third one which I should know and which I normally, but it'll come to me later. It's a European garden. And the central space, which is very much about orientation and views, is also about vertical air movement through the building. So it's about breaking down the scale, humanizing the experience, and also reducing the energy. You can see from this, which was one of my sketches at the time of the competition submission, looking across at that central space with the views of the city. So here you can see the way that the service corps happen at each of the 3 corners, and it's rather like a petal formation with the garden there, and here the vertical space running up the full height of the building. These are some of the graphs which show that the energy savings are in excess of 50% of a conventional air-conditioned building. Nonetheless, it is a controlled environment. And here you can see the building under construction. If I had more time and space, I would talk about the importance of the way that the building is enclosed on 3 of its sides by low buildings, that you penetrate through this new facade, which links with the historic facade here, on the pedestrian side of the building. So you really squeeze into this space. It's very tight, it's very close-knit, part of the urban fabric. And then round the edge of the building is a shortcut, which is a new kind of galleria, which is part restaurant, part art gallery, part urban shortcut to move from one side of the site to the other. And then the tower comes down to the ground very, very clearly on Grosse Gallerstrasse here, which is the main route, the main car route, which has a totally different scale. So again, that would come on another occasion. I thought I might end up with the smallest project in the office, because there are a lot of things in between. This was a door handle in Magdeburg Cathedral, which interested me at the time that I gave a talk in Magdeburg and I visited the cathedral. And it's very, very difficult to describe. It's a stylized bird on the door, but it actually is one of the most comfortable experiences that I've ever had of actually holding a handle to open a door. It's appropriately monumental because it's a very heavy door. But sometime later, probably about 2 years later, we were asked by Fusital to design a door handle. And these are some of the sketches that I did, a huge number at the time, inspired by that, but then starting to look at something that I guess, like everybody, you know, if you go home or in the office, there's the de rigueur sort of D handle, which is very elegant, very refined, very functional, and obviously very nice the way that it's taken out of one bar. I don't see how you can actually take that very eloquent design diagram further, but it seems that there is another tradition, and that is the idea that that a door handle is something very, very comfortable to grasp, and it's inviting, and it responds to, you know, to the palm, rather in a more friendly, more embracing, traditional way than than the bent bar. And there were other points of reference, and these are very, very brief glimpse out of a very large body of material. A lot of study models using clay, using foam, and developing the idea that there could be a family of handles. Not only the door handle, but a family of handles for taps, for showers, for hooks, for windows. And that it doesn't necessarily have to be a sort of single experience. If you think about the world of penknives, it's quite interesting that there are very expensive penknives with pearl handles. There are, you know, jazzy penknives with bright-colored plastic. There are penknives with wooden handles. But the chassis, the core that does the job of the knife and the folding mechanisms, in the case of the Swiss one, all the other things that pop out, but essentially the handles could be, rather like the penknife, you could have wood, you could have leather, you could have plastic, it could be soft, it could be dull, it could be shiny, metal, it could be glass, it could be rubber, it could be plastic. There'd be the possibility for a whole different range of expression and feel in different buildings, or indeed in the same building. And it's quite interesting that this one, which is all of the same materials, completely different feel and appearance from that one there. It's a very, very small glimpse into the range of projects. It's the end, and I thought I'd just really end on the most important note, and that is the nature of the office. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen it, visited it. It is essentially, in spirit and every other way, one big room, and we all have one place at a bench, and it's very much a total team. And I guess I'm the ambassador here. I'm very privileged to be a part of that team and to have the opportunity to communicate some of the work that we've been doing. Thank you.
Did you take some questions?
Sure.
Would you like to join in?
Sure.
I'm sure there must be some questions now. It's wonderful. Thank you very much. Who would like to?
Where there's usually a dead silence, which means we all want to drink and supper.
Yes, sure. Well, we'll try and keep it brief, but I'm sure there will be. Who's going to start? Can you make me start again? Please go ahead. Do we have the microphones?
Hi, my name is George Stowell. I've got quite a personal question. I was born and brought up in Cambridge and had the pleasure of going along to King's College Chapel for years and years and years. I think it's a masterpiece of light and space. And I also had the pleasure of going down when I was a student down to Stansted and watching the building going up from the slab to the columns to the roof. And I was very surprised when the slab went in on the first floor, because I thought this space was a wonderful cathedral-like space. I wanted to ask you, and I've always wanted to ask you, what you felt when that slab went in after that sort of space was half filled in, because it was a wonderful space just as a structure.
Same as you. I mean, it's the short answer, but it really says everything. It was, you're absolutely right, it was a great loss. It had an extraordinary scale. But I think that what is, on the other hand, I think that there's, on a project like that, tremendous pressure to, at every turn, suburbanize. And I think that it was an extraordinary achievement in the circumstances to be able to, for the scale of the space that remained, to survive in the way that it did. And I think that rather like our own office, where we had to do extraordinary economic justifications with the owner of the building that we rent space from, to demonstrate that you can extend the mezzanine, you can make two conventional offices, you can convert it to residential. And there I think that there was, on the advocacy side, a tremendous level of justification necessary to create the kind of space that we ended up with. in terms of acoustics, air movement, lighting, but also the scale of a space and the ordering of that space related to the, the needs of an airport, which are very difficult to quantify. But no, you're right.
Given the amount of time since you worked personally with Buckminster Fuller, could you reflect now on what he might have, at seeing the present discourse in architecture about energy, sustainability, seeing the kind of structures being built, perhaps particularly in Britain, but in Europe, could you reflect on where he might have been very satisfied with what's happening, but perhaps also disappointed with how things have the course things have taken since you worked together?
I think the first thing he'd say is, I told you all so. And I think now he's still, everything that he said and wrote is so far ahead of where we are now. And I think it'll be a long time before he's really acknowledged in that sense. I think that for many people he was a kind of geodesic dome salesman, and that was such a small part of that, of his vocabulary. And I think his messages in terms of energy and the way that, trends, I think quite extraordinary. I had to write the foreword to a book which a colleague had produced on the evolution of solar architecture, and I wasted a lot of time. I mean, I should have just gone straight back to Bucky, which is what I eventually did, and I to try and make a particular point, about the use of energy and the improvement of performance and the way that you could use resources more efficiently and more joyfully. I remembered something, but I couldn't find the source of it. And I finally uncovered it, much to my surprise. And it was something that he wrote a long time ago in a rather obscure publication called The American Scholar. And he, in a beautiful way, pointed out the inefficiency, the waste, the energy consumption of 125,000 tons of copper cable that connected Britain and America, and how 1/4 ton of a satellite, how that with greater fidelity handles enormous capacity. And I think his analogies from whether it was that or his demonstration that Paul McCrady's Gossamer Albatross, the first man-powered aircraft, that it was possible by going back to basics and using the latest materials, the highest technology. But he was extraordinary humanist. I mean, I remember the very first thing that he said when I took him to the Sainsbury Centre was to go up to the objects and say, they feel just right in this space, don't they? I mean, he then followed with how much does the building weigh? And if you find out how much it weighs, it'll tell you some interesting stories, which it did, because, when you looked at the problems of the basement of that building, which was enormously heavy and really quite costly, the unit cost of that and the environment that it was produced compared with what was above ground. And he was an extraordinary individual, I think, that still full of the most pertinent lessons for now and the future.
Is there an area where we might be particularly disappointed?
Oh yes, I'm sure. I mean, he was impatient. I mean, what the hell were we doing wasting our time?
I wanted to ask you a question about the Reichstag project, specifically about the dome, which is very beautiful. The dome was, the original dome that was on the Reichstag was subsequently removed at the Second World War, after the war, and the building was without this dome for many, many years, and the discussion of putting a dome back or not was very much debated. There was a lot of debate about it in Berlin. It was the proposal of putting a dome back on the building was also one of the features of one of the other competitors who joined first, Calatrava, in that competition. Did you want to try and integrate that piece of his design into the overall scheme, or did you also, you had talked a lot about the past of the building and the past qualities of the building. Did you want to bring that back and give it a particular prominence? I was interested why you adopted, again, a dome solution, which was such an important point of the building previously.
I think that that like any competition, it throws up a number of solutions, and certainly one of those solutions was the reinvention of the historic dome, and the Calatrava scheme certainly did have a dome which was 4 flat planes and which replicated the historic dome. And it was, like the original historic dome, a gesture. It was a symbolic gesture. It didn't relate to anything that was inside the building. It was saying, here is a dome to replace the historic dome. And in that sense, it was internally a void. It didn't relate. And our original scheme signaled the fact that something was changing to the Reichstag, and that related to the scale of the building at that time. What then happened is that working with the politicians, working with that group, and developing from the base scheme, that the issues of lighting, of ecology, the development of the public space at the top, those started to develop. They developed into the form of something which I haven't shown, but was quite an interesting structure. It was two dishes which surmounted that space, and below it had the cone, and it had a spiral, and it had a tensegrity structure, very much in the tradition of Bucky Fuller. And that was really because, testing the waters, the appetite of the politicians to actually embrace those very controversial ideas of the ecology and the movement up to ascend, as they took root, those were accepted. That was virtually agreed, and at that point we were asked to do another version. It's very, very difficult to communicate some of the extraordinary decision-making processes in that democratic sequence, where if you have a political committee, then the group of opposing factions who would, by tradition, the very nature of their job would be to challenge each other and to disagree. And what would be interesting here is that they would finally, because it was their house and they were charged with the responsibility as a building committee, agree. So they agreed on that particular solution. The problem was that they didn't have the authority as a committee. They could only have the authority of the parties that they would go back to. So quite often, for political reasons, in some cases because somebody might want to delay the move to Berlin from Bonn, which is very controversial. It was a very narrow majority that approved. First of all, approved the idea that it had to be the Reichstag rather than a new building, and then approved the move and all that followed from it. And there was a a great pressure to bring back the historic dome as a gesture, the four-sided, empty thing. And I said that, you know, if they wanted somebody to do that kind of dome, which was a totally functionless, symbolic, empty pastiche, then they should find somebody else, and it was absolutely fine by us. So they said, well, what you've demonstrated is something else, is something very different. It's about the ecology, it's about the energy, it's about ventilation, it's about lighting, it's about movement. It's not a dome like that. It's not the historic dome. Couldn't you embody those ideas? Could you demonstrate that in a shape which is not the one that they'd accepted when they came back from the factions? And so we said we would undertake that study, which we did, and we demonstrated that we could. And I'm delighted with it. And on that issue, when we were up on the turret there, my partner, David Nelson, who you saw, scanned the horizon. He came back to me and he said, I've counted 14 domes. Is Calatrava going to sue them, or are they going to sue him? You know, I mean, or do we go back to Brunelleschi? I mean, I think a dome is a dome is a dome, but there are many different kinds, and this one is not an empty gesture.
It's just a parenthesis in connection with the Berlin thing. You mentioned Brunelleschi, that's where they got the shape, because it does look remarkably like this in the inverted chain of Brunelleschi's dome in Florence.
No, it was a chance connection. I was...
My question is referring to the airport in Hong Kong. And if I can quote some of the things you said during your lecture tonight, one sentence was...
Don't quote them back.
allowing the individual control at the point at which the system takes over. And what I liked...
Sorry?
Allowing the individual control at the point at which the system takes over, that was referring to the air handling system in the Commerzbank.
Wait a minute, you said on Hong Kong Airport?
Yeah, but this is just taking a
Oh, I
sentence
say, okay,
from your
I
discussion.
don't remember saying that about Hong Kong Airport. If I
Sorry.
said it about Frankfurt, yes, okay.
Okay, and what I like about this sentence is if one looks at Hong Kong Airport, this huge intervention, for which you suggest there's it's a 5-kilometer run around the outside of the building, and it takes 10
It's actually 4.6, but...
and it's 10 tons of rice to feed the workforce. What I'm interested in is how does your practice address the issue of which this huge intervention makes on Hong Kong as a whole, and how it plugs into the city and the infrastructure and the transportation network, and how it allows the individual control at the point in which your system of the airport takes over?
The answer is a very simple one. It's totally outside our control. We've had absolutely nothing to do with it. I mean, nothing. I mean, it's like when I arrived at Stansted, I remember at one point, and I'd become very used to seeing the building in its, you know, below the tree line, and one day I arrived for a site visit, and I couldn't believe it. Turned the corner, and there was this row of these god-awful light fittings that just disappeared into infinity, and all you could see was the light fittings. You couldn't see the trees. And at that particular point, you know, that is somebody else's responsibility. And fascinated though I am, and by the extraordinary infrastructure which makes Hong Kong Airport possible, the sheer energy and drive and optimism, I mean, to see the bridge coming together. In the end, the scale of it is such that it is so breathtaking. The energy, the optimism in that part of the world is so incredible that that you end up forgiving so much of the ugliness because it is so, you know, it's so incredible, it's so gutsy. But it is a very, very real problem. You know, you look at at any of these airports and you suddenly find that there is another development taking place, next to it, and you know that that a lot of these things totally contradict master plans which have been, put forward with good intentions to sort of calm the environment and effect those graceful changes between, one system and another. But I guess it's until you have a shared culture of what really is, of a certain level, it's inevitable. But I guess, it's the transfer from the aircraft that you arrive and, it's no control.
Maybe I could ask one question about the city. You mentioned something at the beginning about the Nîmes project, and specifically this idea of sort of reinterpreting certain parts of the city in a number of projects, such as Nîmes, and I think I know that one of your favorite projects is Charros, the Maison de Verre, in terms of the whole reinterpretation of the Maison Particulière in a way that still is really a contemporary project, but very much involved with this question of tradition. And yet when we go through the more recent projects, of course, the scale of these projects change. And there is a point at which it becomes quite difficult for the projects to have those kinds of traditional relationships to the city. So they begin to have different sets of relationships to the city. The scale, the whole sort of issue of so many of the projects, I think, introduces a number of other dimensions. On the one hand, I think it would be very interesting to find out what your thoughts are about this shift in scale in the projects. And I think indirectly, related to this issue, it would be very interesting to find out your thoughts about in relation to London a little bit, because again, you have obviously been involved in projects to do with the city. Now you're not, in a sense, dealing with a large section of London. Given the kind of experience in terms of these international projects, what would you hope, in a sense, as a sort of possible set of projects to do with London? In some sense, shifting the emphasis away from your own projects, but in a sense, thinking more specifically about the city and its future possibilities.
I don't know whether I can hold on to the sequence because there are several questions which link together, and I think that the first one was about Nîmes, and it's a pity I should have shown Nîmes. Maybe there'll be another occasion. But I think that what is interesting about Nîmes is that the other interventions in terms of the paving, rerouting buses, the ability to close the space to traffic for the 2 weeks of the ferries and at weekends, the way that the Maison Carrée, the Roman temple, is lit and that reflects light onto the buildings, the way in which it recreates that street pattern. I think that all those other things are as important as the building itself. And I would stress that because I think that the project has brought that quarter of Nîmes to life. There is a cafe life, there's it's alive in a way that it was dead and seedy and run down before. The building's been the catalyst, but without the urban works, the urban landscaping which spread out from the building and that we had responsibility for and we drew attention to at the time of the competition. And it was really the fact that in all of these projects, and this one is, if you like, the example to demonstrate it, the architect is not the person who can actually achieve that. The architect, a bit like the question on the interface, can go on until you're blue in the face about the importance of that transfer and that should be of the same standard of this. And in many, many places, one would have the same reaction. In Nîmes, with a very sympathetic mayor, very progressive, he followed that through. He gave us the opportunity to do it, but he was really the truly creative individual. I mean, without doubt. So that, I think, and I'll emphasize that because I'm going to come back to it in terms of London. So you then went on to ask questions about the scale and the way that you, those lessons, how can they be interpreted into the scale of something which is, as it were, remote from the city? I think that they can only try and create their own environments because they are cut adrift. I mean, literally, the airport is on a man-made island. So your hope there is that you will create another world within that building, and the scale is that scale, and that is the challenge. I think it is the same problem as a building at the other end of the scale, and if I had more time or it was a longer conversation, I'd show the little thing that we did in the Forth Valley, which takes a shoestring budget for a health authority that felt it had been not well served by the people who had previously done facilities for the medically handicapped. And the buildings that they were reacting against were a generation of buildings that were rather like barrack blocks. And so they left it to the last possible moment. They had £1 million to spend, and they had 4 weeks in which to spend it. So with them, we crashed through a sympathetic local authority. We got planning permission, and simultaneously we went on a buying spree, and we bought a huge amount of traditional materials, blocks and so on, and we ordered glulam beams, and we created this little, it's like a tiny hamlet. It is around a small garden which faces south as a kind of sanctuary, and literally roses around the door, and everybody has their own entrance to small units. And it creates its world, cut adrift from the city. So, in a way, I think that the city poses very particular problems about how you knit in new buildings into the old, how you extend the life of the old buildings. I think those separate communities, whether they're tiny on the scale of a little group in the Forth Valley or huge on a man-made island in Hong Kong, if we come back to London, I think that the thing that London needs is the equivalent of what we were doing at Nîmes outside of the Maison Carrée. I mean, what it needs the glue that binds all those historic and new buildings together, properly sorted out. And it's been said, so many times ad nauseum. So, I mean, it's almost like a platitude. It's a cliche. I'm saying the same thing. It's the way that spaces should be given up to pedestrians. It's the way that paving should be treated with pride. It's the way that you can walk alongside the river, that you can have outdoor cafes. It's all that. That's not to say there isn't a pressing need for good new public buildings as well, instead of all the various conversions and upgrading of existing buildings. Again, all that's been said. So I'm singing the same tune as everybody else, I guess.
Hello, I would like to make a question on the Stansted Airport. I usually fly there, and I think it's probably the most relaxing airport of London, actually, and it's very nice when you land and see the elevation. It's very, I think, very well done. When you enter in it, I think the atmosphere is very good, and when you fly it, actually, and you are not very relaxed, the atmosphere is very relaxing. The only thing is that when you enter, what I really don't like is the partition inside. Actually, create a sort of barrier. You really would like not to have them.
Sure.
I know that you need
Sure.
it,
No.
but I think that is something that in the project probably you thought about it. And every time I'm in that building, I wonder why it's like that. I mean, is that because you needed flexibility? Is something that it's related to an idea of space which is, in a way, is very much similar to the space inside Beaubourg, for instance, where you have a big space and then you have small partition, and you try to create small spaces within that. I mean, I would like to know more about what's your concept of the space within that building?
It's quite interesting because it really does, again, in a chance way, not in intentionally, I'm sure, but pick up on the question about, you know, systems and responsibilities, and sometimes those connect outside a building, and sometimes they connect inside, and the rules around what is acceptable or not acceptable in terms of customs, immigration, security, what you can or can't see. I mean, those are laws unto themselves, and there's no choice involved. You know, on retailing and the way that that is integrated into airports, I think that Stansted is in relative terms still the open space which is about orientation, and that is the priority, notwithstanding that, as you say quite rightly, it's in that sense it's far from ideal. Maybe, you know, the ideal is that it's free and open and allows free and open passage, and whether that comes with, you know, the total Europeanization and the fact that we really don't have to go through some of the hoops and filters that we do at the moment. That's easily achieved. They're non-structural. I think that the airport experience in some airports where you know, you're hard pressed to find your way, you actually do feel quite seriously, I don't mean this jokingly, that it's made deliberately difficult to find your way to the aircraft in the expectation that you will pass more shops in the maze and eventually buy more goods. So I think to that extent we've been mercifully spared so far.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay.
We'll come back soon.
Oh, look forward to that. Thank you. Thank you.